necessarily in a favorable way.
I sued Starbucks because I spilled a Frappuccino in my lap and beer it was cold. I'm going to sue! Yes, I'm going to sue!
The media in corporate America turned a disadvantage into an advantage, an extreme advantage as to how they dealt with this case and its aftermath. I mean, Mrs. Liebeck became a joke. The jury function became a joke, notwithstanding the fact that we had 12 good, hardworking New Mexico citizens on that jury, and it was a unanimous verdict. But they did a masterful job of taking this simple verdict and turning it upside down, as though people like Mrs. Liebeck are trying to take economic advantage of the whole legal system.
The tort reform groups, they love the McDonald's coffee case. This was a perfect case for them because it looked like it was frivolous.
I had heard the word tort reform before my mother was injured, but I had never really understood what that meant.
A tort is a pastry, as far as I know.
It's also some type of funding that the federal government has done for bailout money, I believe.
Oh, I thought that was tort.
No, I think it's tort.
I have no idea what a tort is.
A tort is a piece of, I think a tort is a piece of bread that looks like a hoagie roll, but isn't a hoagie roll.
So a tort is a harm. It's when someone commits a tort, they have harmed you in some way.
I've heard the statement, tort reform.
Do you know what it means?
No.
Tort reform would mean trying to clean up the logistics of suing people or trying to make it easier or harder. I'm not quite sure which way tort reform tends to work.
Well, tort reform is a term drummed up by some of the advertising people for the business sector, which is to limit the likelihood that you can bring a lawsuit.
It is essentially laws that restrict people's rights to go to court.
I don't think that the term, I'm not going to say it. I won't say the word tort reform, that phrase, because I don't think that it is an accurate representation of what's really going on.
Ralph Nader calls it tort deform. So I guess reform is in the eyes of the beholder. But if you want to change a system which had become, in the late 1970s, very, very pro-plaintiff in the view of some, if you want to change it, usually the word reform is used.
This big push to publicize the McDonald's case came in the midst of an attempt to pass federal legislation that was going to limit the consumer's right to go to court. It meant that there were going to be caps on damages, that there were going to be all sorts of changes in the rules of what you could do in order to bring a case into court. And so there was this humongous campaign by industry attempting to affect juries, but also attempting to affect senators. And the McDonald's case became the poster child for what's wrong with people going to court and suing.
We looked at the congressional hearings about the tort reform bill, and we found that the most common reference to justify tort reform was the McDonald's coffee case. There were not many statistical studies. The primary evidence was that everybody knows the McDonald's coffee case, therefore we need tort reform.
If a lady goes to a fast food restaurant, puts coffee in her lap, burns her legs and sues and gets a big settlement, that in and of itself is enough to tell you why we need to have tort reform.
And in fact, what happened was it did pass the Senate, and President Bill Clinton did veto it.
This legislation is arcane, complex. It has a lot of legalisms and loopholes in it, but the real fact is it could have a devastating impact on innocent Americans.
And so what happened was corporate America sort of went to a plan B. So they went to a lot of state legislatures and asked the state legislatures to pass laws that would limit the rights and remedies of individuals in various ways.
And they were constantly on the attack because they had so many PR firms that they had hired to go out and do their work in the different states.
A woman was awarded $2.9 million in a lawsuit against McDonald's. She spilled hot coffee on her lap while sitting in her car and claimed it was too hot. Every day we hear about another outrageous lawsuit. Who pays? You do. Tell the legislature we can't afford another $1 million cup of coffee.
One of the most significant PR efforts was spearheaded by the American Tort Reform Association, ATRA.
The American Tort Reform Association is a group of several hundreds businesses and also colleges and universities, and I'm their general counsel. and they are dedicated to try to see that there's a fair and balanced legal system in the United States.
The American Tort Reform Association was formed in 1986 by about 300 major corporations, insurance companies, chemical companies, oil and gas, pharmaceutical companies. They were going to start advocating for laws all around the country to limit the liability of all their members. And so they hired a PR firm, and they came up with these groups called Citizens Against Lawsuit Abuse. They were to give the impression that these were just citizen groups that had sprung up spontaneously.
AstroTurf groups, so they looked like they were grassroots groups, but they really had no people in them. They were all run through the PR firm. That's what Citizens Against Lawsuit Abuse was.
The tobacco industry was actually funding a lot of this, that they would funnel money through a Washington, D.C. law firm called Covington and Burling that would then distribute tobacco money to some of these Citizens Against Lawsuit Abuse groups.
Was there any distortions by people in the media, by politicians, by people who wanted tort reform? Sometimes stories were repeated and repeated over and over again. It happens all the time, that were not true or they were unfounded. I don't think it was intentional.
Listen to just a few cases. I hope I won't be repeating some that maybe have already been told to you. In California, a man was using a public telephone booth to place a call. An alleged drunk driver careened down the street, lost control of her car, and crashed into the phone booth. Now, it's no surprise that the injured man sued, but you might be startled to hear whom he sued. The telephone company and associated firms. That's right.
There's a telephone booth in the corner of a very busy intersection in Los Angeles, and this guy was standing inside, and he saw this car coming right at him, and he tried to get out of the phone booth, and the door stuck. And the reason that this was the fault of the telephone company is that there have been lots of other cases where this telephone booth had been hit by cars because it was in a very dangerous position, and it hadn't been properly repaired, so the guy couldn't get out. And so he was hit inside the phone booth. He lost his leg. He was extremely ill.
You know, it was not the source of real humor the way Reagan had portrayed it. And so there are a lot of stories like that. For me, you know, not being a lawyer, I am a journalist, and I felt like journalists had just really not done a good job of covering, and that they had fallen for lots of public relations ruses that they should know better about.
There was even a story of somebody taking a lawnmower to trim a hedge, and there was a lawsuit, and actually it never occurred. So there was some scare tactics that really didn't have basis in fact.
I didn't take this job to sit around and worry about getting sued.
If we don't stop lawsuit abuse,
I might not be able to do my job.
and my job just might be to save your life.
Join the jury against lawsuit abuse. Call 1-800.
It was supposedly just a group of business people and community leaders who were acting on their own, when in fact, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign, orchestrated out of Washington, D.C., with the help of people like Karl Rove, who had their own business and financial interest in pushing the agenda of tort reform and making it look like it was a totally spontaneous event.
Texas must end the junk lawsuits that clog our courts and threaten our producers.
In Texas in the mid-90s, you had Karl Rove and then candidate Bush come along and see that there was a real political advantage to talking about so-called tort reform.
Karl Rove was, in the early 1990s, a consultant for Philip Morris for the tobacco industry.
He was working for Philip Morris and Bush at the same time. He was on the Philip Morris payroll, so he had a lot of ties to these folks.
Rove saw that if he used tort reform and if his candidates ran on tort reform, it would make it that much easier for him to open the pockets of the business community.
And then once Governor Bush was elected, it was Katie bar the door. They implemented all of the things that interests like insurance companies and the healthcare industry and others wanted in Texas.
And so it's with great pleasure that I sign a cap on punitive damages that will add certainty to the business climate.
And a lot of the people who had been his biggest financial backers in Texas, they followed him right to the White House, so he kept going.
No one has ever been healed by a frivolous lawsuit. I urge the Congress to pass medical liability reform. Our economy is held back by irresponsible class actions and frivolous asbestos claims. And I urge Congress to pass legal reforms this year. Because lawsuits are driving many good doctors out of practice, leaving women in nearly 1,500 American counties without a single OBGYN, I asked the Congress to pass medical liability reform this year.
He was tort reformer in chief. He really brought that issue to the center stage in a way nobody else had ever done.
Too many good docs are getting out of business. Too many OBGYNs aren't able to practice their love with women all across this country. We're a litigious society. Everybody's suing, it seems like. There are too many lawsuits in America.
If you have the right words that evoke your whole system of thought and your way of understanding an issue, and when that language is repeated over and over, the brain changes. The circuitry gets stronger and can become permanent.
In my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda.
So they would get their message out there, and then the public would pressure their local legislators to enact caps on damages and other kinds of liability limits. So there was a direct link between the PR that was done and ultimately the passage of laws.
I mean, I've heard so many ridiculous stories about she was asking for $30 million or, something equally ridiculous. Basically, Stella told them, I want you to cover what Medicare doesn't cover, and I want you to get a better lid on that coffee because I don't want this to happen to another person. And that was basically what she was asking for.
When somebody goes to court, they're doing something extraordinary that is hidden. To go to court and to sue is not a simple procedure. You have to go through a lot of trouble to do it. It affects your life. You're going to be attacked in all kinds of ways. Going to court to gain justice is heroic. That idea has to be out there. That is, when you, quote, win a case, you win it for other people, as well as gaining justice for yourself.